canceled that episode. They never aired that episode, and then they canceled the show.
This isn't cool!
Whatever you do, don't sneeze.
A reality show once dared contestants to face insects, heights, and even raw organs. But nothing prepared viewers for the stunt so shocking it was banned before it could air in America. For 20 years, the episode lived in whispers, leaked clips, and tabloid headlines, said to be the moment that canceled a revival of Fear Factor. Now, with new platforms and re-releases, that forbidden hour can finally be seen. Why was it buried? And what does its return reveal about reality TV's darkest limits? The episode that crossed the line. Fear Factor had built its entire identity on pushing boundaries. From its 2001 debut, the show reveled in forcing contestants to choke down organs, lie in tanks filled with snakes, and dangle from skyscrapers. Audiences tuned in precisely because they knew NBC would stage things no other network dared. But in early 2012, during the show's revival run, producers lined up a stunt that went beyond the usual phobias and gross-outs. It was a twins versus twins episode with a rural-sounding title that hinted at barnyard humor. On the surface, it looked like more of the same, just another chance to test endurance and gag reflexes. Yet behind the scenes, network executives grew uneasy. This challenge wasn't just shocking. It was the kind of act that threatened to shatter television standards, attract the wrong kind of headlines, and invite a backlash bigger than the prize money on offer. Even before cameras rolled, whispers about the challenge made their way onto blogs and fan forums. When images leaked online, the reaction was instant. Fear Factor had long been criticized for crossing lines of taste, but this was different. The outrage wasn't playful disgust. It was visceral rejection. Viewers who'd previously laughed at bug buffets or eyeball cocktails suddenly felt queasy at what they were reading. Within NBC's offices, the mood shifted from cautious excitement to panic. By the time the episode was scheduled to air, the network had already made its decision: pull it. At the last minute, the supposed spectacle was replaced by a rerun. The pulled episode became a ghost, whispered about but never officially broadcast on American television. The choice fueled curiosity even more. What could possibly be so grotesque that the very network which had built Fear Factor's reputation around extremity was now saying, too far? The answer, at least in part, lies in how television worked in 2012. The internet wasn't new, but social media was just beginning to show its teeth. A shocking stunt was no longer confined to its one-hour broadcast window. Any clip could be ripped, uploaded, and shared endlessly. Memes could be spun from a single screenshot. Network executives didn't just worry about whether Middle America would be disgusted. They worried about a stunt becoming the face of NBC on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, stripped of context, and replayed 1,000,000 times with no way to soften the blow. In that kind of environment, Fear Factor was an expensive liability. One episode could undo years of brand building, not just for the show, but for the host, Joe Rogan, who had a growing career outside of reality TV. NBC wasn't willing to take that risk. Pulling the episode was less about protecting contestants or shielding delicate viewers. It was about brand safety, advertiser comfort, and the simple calculation of, is this worth the headache? That decision created a paradox. By yanking the broadcast, NBC inadvertently transformed a one-off gross-out into legend. To fans, the missing hour became a forbidden text, a lost episode that must have contained something unspeakable. The truth is slightly less dramatic. The episode wasn't destroyed, nor was it erased from existence. In fact, it aired abroad later that year, slipped into international schedules where standards differed. Clips surfaced on YouTube, sometimes officially, sometimes through bootlegs, fueling the mythology. By the mid-2010s, even mainstream streaming platforms began acknowledging the episode in their Fear Factor catalogs, sometimes with disclaimers, sometimes locked behind regional restrictions. Suddenly, the show's most notorious ghost had a digital footprint. It was searchable, indexable, and impossible to pretend away. That's what makes 2025 such a turning point. The so-called banned episode is no longer just rumor, no longer just clips shared in the darker corners of the internet. It has resurfaced in legitimate contexts, listed on platform episode guides, referenced in mainstream coverage, even preserved in official franchise materials. In other words, the most infamous moment in Fear Factor history has moved from the shadows into a place where audiences can finally view it for themselves, with all the context of hindsight. The network may have said no in 2012, but that didn't stop millions from eventually finding out what happened. And that raises the next mystery. If NBC pulled the plug, how did so many people still end up seeing the most infamous minutes in reality TV history? How a banned episode still escaped. When NBC pulled the episode in January 2012, executives might have hoped it would quietly disappear, fading into rumor like other unaired television experiments. But within months, that hope collapsed. In June of the same year, a Danish broadcaster went ahead and aired the episode in full. What was forbidden in the United States suddenly became primetime fare in Europe. Danish media outlets wrote about it. Reviews trickled across borders, and the existence of the hour could no longer be denied. That single overseas airing changed the story from a scrapped stunt to a suppressed episode. Once a television cut exists in another market, control shifts from deletion to containment. Instead of erasing it, NBC had only ensured that it would be archived, shared, and inevitably leaked back into American awareness. In other words, the attempt to bury the stunt gave it international life. By the mid-2010s, the episode had taken on a second, subtler form of immortality, the breadcrumbs left behind by official platforms themselves. Fear Factor's own online presence began to feature short clips, carefully edited and uploaded to YouTube. These weren't fan bootlegs shot off a grainy TV screen. They were clean, official, and unmistakably real, confirming the episode's authenticity even if they didn't show it in full. At the same time, streaming platforms and episode aggregators began listing the unaired hour by title. Apple TV, Just Watch, and other guides included the episode in their Fear Factor catalogs, sometimes with the caveat that it was not available in your region. But the metadata was visible. It sat in plain sight, searchable and verifiable, carrying a synopsis that removed any doubt. To a fan who had only heard whispers, seeing the episode recognized in the same lineup as every other Fear Factor installment was proof enough. It wasn't a myth. It was there, acknowledged, hiding in plain sight. This is where the internet's strange alchemy took over. The so-called banned episode didn't just sit on dusty hard drives or in obscure foreign broadcasts. It was fed into the endless churn of online content. Commentary channels dissected the challenge, adding their reactions and critiques. News recaps retold the story in punchy headlines designed to shock and amuse. Reaction videos captured viewers' disgust in real time, looping the same grotesque moments for maximum effect. The result was an algorithmic resurrection. Even if NBC never aired the episode in America, the digital ecosystem did the job for them. Every time someone labeled it too much for TV, another audience went looking for it, and another link circulated. That cycle created a kind of practical end run around NBC's original ban. People didn't need to sit down at 8 p.m. in front of their televisions to see what had been denied. They only needed a search bar, a friend's repost, or a recommended video sidebar. The more NBC tried to distance itself, the more the internet leaned in. The forbidden fruit effect took over. If a major network was too nervous to show it, then surely it must be worth finding. And once the video reached a critical mass of uploads and commentary, it was no longer possible to scrub it clean. The episode had become immortal, preserved not by a broadcaster, but by the collective fascination of the audience. What NBC discovered too late was that the logic of the early 2010s internet was different from the broadcast era. Suppression no longer meant silence. It meant amplification. The more loudly you declared something unfit for public view, the faster it traveled across platforms designed to highlight exactly what people weren't supposed to see. And that leads us to the deeper question. If the internet made this episode unforgettable, what exactly was it that the network feared in the first place? What too far means on reality TV? For years, Fear Factor thrived on the delicate balance between fascination and disgust. Contestants were pushed into tanks of snakes, forced to chow down on insects, or hung from helicopters high above city skylines. These challenges were undeniably extreme, yet they operated within an unwritten rule of reality television. Repulsed, not revolted. Audiences tuned in because they wanted to squirm, gag, and shake their heads at the spectacle. But they still felt they were watching a game, a test of nerve, a showcase of people facing fears most would never willingly confront. When the line was crossed into something that seemed less like testing limits and more like pure revulsion, the illusion broke. The banned episode from 2012 represented precisely that breach. Instead of evoking shock with a twisted kind of admiration, "I can't believe they did that," viewers and executives alike felt unsettled in a way that was harder to laugh off. This wasn't a challenge about phobias, nor was it an act that could be defended as a test of skill or endurance. It was bodily, graphic, and absurd in a way that had little to do with fear. It was the television equivalent of an endurance dare gone wrong at a college party. The stunt wasn't frightening, it was revolting. And in that subtle but crucial distinction, Fear Factor lost the very framework that had kept it viable for over a decade. Without the cover of Facing Fears, the show slipped into a standards crisis. And once that line was crossed, there was no easy way to frame the moment as character building or even remotely defensible. Beyond the content itself, the optics problem loomed even larger. Television is never judged in isolation. It exists in the context of advertisers, affiliates, and the broader cultural conversation. This was especially true in 2012, when NBC was fighting to polish its image and attract a broad, family-friendly audience. In that climate, executives had to consider not just whether the stunt broke legal guidelines, but whether it looked absurdly out of place on primetime broadcast. Is it legal? Was no longer the only question. Will our biggest advertisers be proud to sit next to this? Became the far more urgent one. And in this case, the answer was obvious: no. Brands that had tolerated the bug buffets and death-defying stunts could not plausibly align themselves with something that seemed designed only to disgust. In a media landscape where brand safety was fast becoming the watchword, the optics of the banned episode were indefensible. Even Joe Rogan, who had long served as the steady anchor of Fear Factor, eventually reflected on the limits of the show's formula. Years later, in interviews and on his own podcast, he admitted that as the stunts became more extreme, the show grew less interesting. Escalation for its own sake didn't lead to new revelations about human fear or resilience. It just became repetitive shock. Each new season demanded something bigger, grosser, or more dangerous than the last. But eventually the format hit a ceiling. There was no new truth being uncovered, just a race to outdo the previous spectacle. Rogan noted that this exhaustion made the show less compelling to film and, ultimately, less compelling to watch. That critique lands hardest on the infamous banned episode. Rather than revealing hidden reserves of courage or endurance, it exposed the limits of the format. It wasn't about fear anymore, it was about spectacle collapsing under its own weight. This realization underscores the central question about reality television's boundaries. When does a stunt serve the narrative of facing fears, and when does it become gratuitous, pushing contestants and audiences into places that no longer entertain but simply repel? Fear Factor's banned episode became the case study in that debate. It illustrated how easily the balance could be lost and how costly it could be when it was. It couldn't save the season. The fallout would prove that once a reality show crosses its own boundaries, the audience rarely follows it back. When a stunt sinks a season. By the time NBC revived Fear Factor in late 2011, the show was already walking a tightrope. Reality TV had evolved since the series' original run, and competitors like Survivor and The Amazing Race had proven that stunts could be thrilling without being outright grotesque. NBC's gamble was that viewers missed the raw, unapologetic energy of Fear Factor. But what they got instead was a revival that leaned harder into shock, just as cultural tolerance for that kind of spectacle was shrinking. The result was a fragile reboot that collapsed under the weight of its most controversial decision. When the infamous banned episode was pulled in January 2012, the timing could not have been worse. The season had only just begun, and viewers were still deciding whether to invest in the revival. Instead of riding a wave of curiosity, NBC broadcast a rerun in the slot where the headline stunt had been promised. For casual audiences, it felt like a bait and switch. For devoted fans, it was a glaring sign that something had gone wrong behind the curtain. Publicity around the revival stopped being about the contestants, the stunts, or even Joe Rogan's return. It became about the missing hour. What was NBC hiding? Why had they gone this far, only to slam on the brakes? The revival never recovered. Only 8 episodes aired before momentum died, and with it, NBC's appetite for more. A show that had once thrived on shock now found itself strangled by it. The banned episode overshadowed something else as well. Another hour of television that NBC also chose to withhold. This second case didn't involve the same level of grotesque imagery, but it revealed how precarious the revival truly was. The 2-part episode in question contained challenges involving head shaving and chemical deterrence, scenarios that network standards flagged as problematic for very different reasons. In an earlier era, NBC might have quietly edited or trimmed the offending moments. But in 2012, a climate of heightened sensitivity meant that entire installments could be delayed or discarded outright. For Fear Factor, a show built on the very premise of flaunting limits, 2 retreats in a single month was catastrophic. To audiences, it looked like the show didn't know where its boundaries were anymore. To NBC, it meant doubling down on caution. Either way, the effect was the same. The revival's brand collapsed under its own contradictions. Lurking behind these specific incidents was a broader truth about reality television. The ever-present specter of lawsuits. Shows like Fear Factor operated in a minefield of legal risks, from defamation claims to safety violations to fears of copycat incidents. Even when lawsuits failed, they left scars. Networks calculated every decision not just against ratings, but against the cost of a potential courtroom battle. Was a headline worth months of legal wrangling? Was a controversial stunt worth the risk of an injury claim or a sponsor walking away? In the case of Fear Factor, the answer became increasingly clear. The balance had tipped too far. Instead of producing high-risk stunts that delivered rewards in ratings, NBC found itself facing high-risk stunts that promised only bad press, legal headaches, and declining viewership. The aftermath sealed the verdict. The revival sputtered out, and the Fear Factor brand was mothballed once again. When it returned in 2017 on MTV with Ludacris as host, the show was noticeably toned down. The focus shifted toward stunts designed to test real-world anxieties, claustrophobia, electricity, and endurance, rather than pushing contestants into spectacles that risked revolt. It was a quieter version of Fear Factor, one that acknowledged the appetite for adrenaline without courting the same kind of disaster that had sunk NBC's revival. The broadcast shock era of Fear Factor was over. So how did the unshowable become visible again, and what finally changed? From urban legend to clickable episode. For years, the banned Fear Factor episode lingered in limbo. A ghost story, whispered by fans, dismissed by skeptics, and referenced in half-truths on internet forums. But that changed in 2012, just months after NBC pulled it from American air. A Danish broadcaster went ahead and aired the entire hour, instantly cracking open the vault. Overnight, the episode transformed from rumor into reality. Danish press outlets covered it. Fan blogs circulated details. Contestants gave cautious interviews in which they hinted at just how horrific the stunt had been, before being advised not to say too much. For the first time, the episode had a verifiable broadcast record. No longer could NBC or anyone else pretend it was just a sensational rumor. Once that foreign airing happened, major outlets in the US and abroad began referencing the episode directly, no longer hedging their language with phrases like alleged or supposed. The footage existed, people had seen it, and fans were now trading links across borders, eager to catch a glimpse of the spectacle their own network had refused to air. That foreign broadcast set the stage for the next step in the episode's strange afterlife: official acknowledgement. By 2014, the franchise itself began releasing short clips on YouTube. These weren't grainy bootlegs shot off a European TV screen. They were high-quality snippets posted from official accounts. While they didn't show the entire challenge, they showed enough to confirm the worst suspicions. The clips said, in effect, yes, this episode is real, and yes, it happened. This was a quiet but important turning point. By allowing even fragments of the banned stunt to appear on its own channels, the Fear Factor brand moved the episode from whispered legend into partial canon. By the time the 20s arrived, the digital footprint had grown even stronger. Episode guides on platforms like Wikipedia, Apple TV, and JustWatch began listing the hour by name. Sometimes the tile was geofenced, locked in certain regions, or marked as not available in your location. But the metadata was there for anyone to see. It included the title, the synopsis, and even cast details. This paper trail gave the episode a form of legitimacy that NBC had once tried to deny it. It was now part of the official record, standing alongside every other episode in the catalog. Even when viewers couldn't click play, the fact that it appeared in guides and databases proved it wasn't an urban myth. The episode existed, was cataloged, and in some regions could even be streamed in full. That visibility is why we can confidently say, in 2025, that the episode can finally be shown, not only in the sense of being viewable, but in the sense of being acknowledged openly, contextualized in the franchise's history, and no longer buried under layers of rumor. This shift highlights the difference between old television logic and platform logic. In the broadcast era, pulling an episode meant it effectively ceased to exist. Unless you recorded it at home, you'd never see it again. In the platform era, the rules are reversed. If something exists anywhere, even in another country, even behind a regional lock, it exists everywhere. Metadata becomes cultural confirmation. A title card on Apple TV or a tile on JustWatch is enough to etch a piece of television into the permanent record. The internet didn't technically unban the episode. Instead, it outlived the ban by making the hour indexable, searchable, and tethered to official libraries. Once something is part of the database, it can't be erased. Was the decision to hide it really about protecting audiences from going too far? Or was it always about protecting sponsors and the network's image? Taste, sponsors, and the safety dance. When viewers talk about banned television, the conversation often drifts toward censorship, imagining a faceless board of censors armed with scissors, snipping away at anything deemed too provocative. But in reality, modern television is governed less by hard and fast laws and more by a triangle of influence: standards and practices, brand partners, and public relations teams. Together, these three forces create the invisible boundaries that shape what makes it to air. If any corner of that triangle objects, the production either bends or breaks. The infamous Fear Factor episode from 2012 hit all three pressure points at once. Standards and practices flagged the stunt as a potential violation of taste guidelines, even if it didn't technically break obscenity laws. Advertisers, meanwhile, saw a nightmare scenario. Associating their brands with the grotesque spectacle risked alienating consumers, especially in an age when news cycles were accelerating online. And the PR wing of NBC understood the inevitable headlines: tabloid outrage, cable news mockery, and late-night hosts making the network's choice into a punchline. It wasn't a matter of the show breaking federal rules. It was a matter of optics. In the gray zone that governs modern reality TV, optics can be even more decisive than legality. This is where the concept of brand safety becomes the deciding factor. In 2012, advertisers were already learning how quickly outrage could spread online. A stunt that might have passed unnoticed a decade earlier could now ignite a viral storm within hours, complete with hashtags and calls for boycotts. For NBC, the calculation was simple. Was the risk of outrage worth the ratings payoff? The answer clearly was no. By pulling the episode, the network wasn't protecting viewers so much as protecting its partners and itself. Fast forward to 2025, and the situation looks a little different. Outrage still spreads faster than ever, but the tools for context are far better. Platforms can append content warnings, advisories, or age gates, providing disclaimers that make controversial content feel managed rather than reckless. A streaming service can say, "Viewer discretion advised," contains disturbing material. With that small addition, the show shifts from scandalous to contextualized. The very feature broadcast TV lacked. A way to guide audiences through difficult content is now standard. That's a key reason why the banned Fear Factor episode can sit on streaming pages today, at least in some regions, while NBC couldn't touch it in 2012. Broadcast was blunt. Streaming is flexible. And then there's the question of the future. With reports of another Fear Factor reboot in development for 2025, the franchise once again finds itself at a crossroads. Will it double down on gross-out spectacle, or will it reinvent itself in a way that fits the cultural moment? The band episode serves as a case study for what not to do. It showed how easily a stunt could topple a season, damage a brand, and derail a revival. But it also provides a blueprint for how the show might move forward. The lesson isn't "don't push limits," it's push them with design, not with shock for shock's sake. A reboot that stages creative, fear-driven challenges, ones rooted in primal anxieties like isolation, endurance, or psychological tension, can thrill audiences without provoking the same backlash. Add social media integration, interactive formats, and contextual framing, and the show might achieve the balance that eluded NBC a decade earlier. Which begs the question, why did this one moment, among hundreds of stunts and episodes, linger in our collective memory long after the show itself faded? Why this episode still haunts us? Most television controversies fade quickly. An offensive joke sparks backlash, a network apologizes, and a week later, it's forgotten. But the banned Fear Factor episode never followed that pattern. It outlived its own season, its own revival, and even its own network run. Why? Because the myth turned out to be bigger than the minutes. People who never watched a single episode of Fear Factor can still describe the stunt. They know it involved a pair of twins, a farmyard theme, and a challenge so grotesque that even the crew reportedly gagged while filming. The details may vary, but the essence has stuck. This is how media legend works. One moment becomes shorthand for an entire brand. For Fear Factor, the missing episode became the franchise itself. Its absence from US broadcast made it forbidden, and in turn, unforgettable. By never showing it, NBC gave the stunt an aura of taboo that no aired episode could match. Contestants dangling from helicopters or submerged in tanks full of eels were intense, but they were accessible. You could tune in and watch them anytime. The band stunt was different. It was locked away, replaced by a rerun, and then whispered about as something too extreme for America to handle. That kind of narrative turns ordinary television into legend. When you tell people they can't see something, it becomes the only thing they want to see. The internet then transformed this forbidden fruit into a permanent exhibit. Clips and commentary circulated endlessly, turning the unaired episode into a kind of artifact in the Museum of Reality TV Taboos. YouTube reactions, TMZ recaps, and Wikipedia footnotes all gave it structure and permanence. Instead of disappearing, it was documented, debated, and reframed. Fans dissected why it crossed a line. Creators compared it to other pulled episodes across television history. And cultural critics pointed to it as an example of spectacle collapsing into absurdity. It wasn't just a gross stunt anymore, it was a cautionary tale. Where Fear Factor claimed to test courage, this episode posed a different question. When does television stop exploring fear and start indulging in the meaningless provocation of, why would anyone do this? The reappearances on platform pages sealed that transformation. Each listing, each synopsis, each tiny tile in a streaming catalog encoded the stunt not as rumor, but as part of the official record. The Forbidden Hour was now a case study, placed alongside other notorious moments in television history, episodes pulled for legal battles, segments edited after tragedies, or jokes erased in syndication. The difference is that this one lived on not because of what was aired, but because of what wasn't. And that makes it especially relevant in 2025. Today, older shows routinely resurface with content cards, disclaimers, or region-specific locks. The instinct is no longer to bury difficult material, but to contextualize it. A streaming platform can show you the thing once deemed unshowable, but it can also frame it with the tools of the modern media ecosystem: viewer discretion advisories, cultural context, or even essays attached to the episode listing. The idea is no longer to erase, but to acknowledge, to let audiences see, learn, and decide for themselves. That shift is why the Fear Factor episode finally feels less like a scandal and more like history. Its resurfacing doesn't mean standards no longer matter. It means we've accepted that pretending something never happened isn't the same as addressing it. For a franchise preparing yet another reboot, that's a healthier bargain than living under the shadow of denial. The episode that once seemed to doom Fear Factor might now serve as its most powerful lesson. Raise stakes in ways that matter, not in ways that court regret. If you want more deep dives into TV's most controversial cuts and comebacks, like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us, should this episode live online with a content advisory or stay lost? And if you're curious how other disappeared reality episodes re-emerged, watch the next video on your screen for another untold story.